Hello and welcome to English 102. I am your instructor, Dr. Sam Lackey, and this is the Week 1 lecture. So today I would mostly like to just introduce the class, talk about what we're doing in here. We'll keep it pretty general. We'll talk a little bit about Canvas. We'll talk a little bit about the course syllabus that can be found in Canvas. But I also want to go ahead and get into our Week 1 material. We don't have a ton to cover in Week 1. I would like us to kind of ease into the semester, but I do want to cover some basic principles of critical reading. And I want to start talking about reading sources, because that is one of our primary areas of focus in this class. So you guys have taken English 101. Many of you may have taken me for English 101. So you can probably understand that this is a continuation of 101. We're sort of picking up where we left off at the end of English 101. And most of you were probably doing some kind of argumentative paper at the end of your 101 class. That was certainly what you were doing if you had my 101 class. And oftentimes you're doing a little bit of research along with that argumentative paper. That's typically how 101 concludes. So here at the beginning of 102, we're picking up with research, writing about sources, and constructing original arguments of our own. So we're continuing to work on a lot of the same basic skills that we were working on back in 101. We're trying to improve our abilities as readers and as writers. So just like in 101, there's going to be a lot of practice, there's going to be a lot of drill in this class as we master some new techniques. But what really separates this class from 101, what makes it different, is the focus on research. And the fact that a lot of the reading that you do in here will be articles, maybe book chapters that you find yourselves through research. So I will assign a few readings to you, mostly early in the semester before our research begins. But once we start researching independently, you guys will be finding your own stuff, reading that stuff, summarizing it, responding to it, and then ultimately using it to help you construct an original argument in research paper form. That's what we are working towards in this class. Our end goal is to write an extensive research paper with lots of sources where we're able to stake out an original argument of our own. So again, we've already done a lot of this. We've kind of gotten into some of this in 101, but here in 102, it's more intense, it's a little bit more labor intensive, and we're going to continue to add new skills, new tools to our tool belts. So it's similar but different from what you've done before. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the basics that you're probably familiar with just from taking previous GBC classes. A lot of you probably have, but if not, that's fine, because nothing is very complicated or difficult to master. So you need to get comfortable with Canvas. If this is your first time taking classes here at GBC, just take a day or two at the beginning of the semester to get comfortable and familiar with Canvas, because that is our online learning platform. And obviously this is an online class, so we are going to be very reliant on Canvas. And you'll get into the rhythm and the routine of this class pretty quickly, because I like routine. I like consistency. I like to sort of do things the same way each week. So you'll notice if you're watching this lecture, you've probably already seen some of the Week 1 material that I've posted in our weekly modules in Canvas. So at the beginning of each week, you need to get into the habit of going into Canvas and just checking out our weekly module. Everything that you need for the week is there. So this is Week 1, so you can find all the pertinent materials for Week 1. this lecture. Also, the week 1 overview, which gives you sort of written notes. I'm giving you sort of a written outline of everything that we're covering for the week. Also, in that overview, you'll find the week's reading assignment. You'll find any other assignments that we have. There's usually going to be a research journal due by the end of the week, and I'll also include any other assignments that we might be working on. So you can find everything in the modules. Just take a moment, look around, get comfortable with the setup. It's not hard to find stuff, but if you are having trouble, just let me know. Also, you can find the course syllabus in the week 1 module. You can also get to it by clicking on the syllabus tab in that left-hand toolbar that you should see when you get into the course module. But take a look at the syllabus, even if it's not right away. You need to do that sometime during week 1 just to get familiar with our course policies, make sure you're spelling my name correctly. You can find my email. Even office hours. I know this is online, but for those of you who are located in Winnemucca or near Winnemucca, you can always come to campus and talk to me in person because I am based at the Winnemucca Center, and I do keep office hours there on Mondays and Wednesdays. So you can find all of that basic info in the course syllabus. Also, my basic policies, the rules, all those things, similar to what you'll find on other course syllabi. But the most important part of the document is near the end. You can look over the rest of the stuff on your own time, but the most important thing is the detailed class schedule. And that gets you get into that around page 4 or page 5, and it takes you to the end of the document. I'm giving you a pretty detailed schedule for the entire semester. So I'm telling you what we're doing each week. I'm telling you what we're covering. Also, in that schedule, you'll find all of our reading assignments, all of our writing assignments, due dates. All of that stuff can be found in the schedule. The reason I've given you that is so you can keep up on your own, even if you get sick or if you have to go out of town. Maybe you kind of fall behind a little bit, or you're not able to check our module at the beginning of the week. That's okay, because you always have this schedule, so you always know, at least generally speaking, what's going on. What are we doing? What assignment is due at the end of the week? You can always check the schedule to see all of that. So if you miss time, if you're away from class for a while, use the schedule to keep up or to catch up. And of course, you can always email me for help with that as well. So take a look when you have time. One thing you'll notice is that assignments for us, our written assignments, are always due at the end of the week. So that's the routine I want us to get into. At the beginning of the week, check all the content that I've posted, take a look at what we're doing, and then by the middle of the week, you should be ready to start doing some of the work. Then you can watch the lecture. Then you can get the assignment for the week done by the end of the week. So for me, for us, for me and for you, the week will begin first thing Monday morning. That's when I publish that week's module. And then the week will end around midnight on Sunday. That's when your work is due. So you always have the full week to get everything done. To read the overview, watch the lecture, complete the reading, and then complete that week's assignment by the end of the day, Sunday. And then first thing the next Monday, we start on our next week. So we'll pretty much be doing that throughout. But if you have questions, if you fall behind, or if you're struggling with anything, do feel free to reach out. Even if you just have a quick question, that's why I've included my email on the syllabus. You can always email me. That's the best way for us to communicate. Also, make sure you're comfortable with your GBC email because you'll be receiving emails from me periodically. I try not to send a ton, but from time to time I will send out reminders. There might be slight changes to the schedule, and I'll try to announce those in the modules, in lecture, but also I'll usually send out an email. So you don't necessarily have to check every single day, but you should check a few times a week just to make sure you're not missing anything. And if you're having trouble with any of this stuff, you can ask me, but you might also want to consult IT, our computer technology services, if you're having issues with your login, if you're having any issues with Canvas or your email. I'm not really a tech guy, but we do have people at GBC that can help. And I can always give you their phone number, their email, if you can't find it on the GBC website. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the actual stuff that we're covering here in week 1. Because if you look at the week 1 overview, you'll notice that we are discussing critical reading. And we're talking about reading sources in particular. Even before we have any sources, and when I say source, I just mean some type of text that you can use to support an argument of your own. So one of our big priorities in this class is to become better researchers. So when we research, we find sources. A lot of these sources are going to be articles from newspapers, magazines, academic journals. In some cases, they might come from websites. That's pretty common, but we don't want to rely exclusively on websites. But we're going to have a lot of sources. Not all of them will necessarily be in written form. Some of them might be videos. Some of them might be news programs or documentaries that you find on YouTube or other places where you can access, videos and other sort of visual type aids. So there's different kinds of sources. We'll talk more about them as we move along in the semester. You can actually generate some sources of your own by conducting interviews or surveys and polls. So there's lots of different ways to conduct research. But most of our research will consist of articles, maybe even book chapters that we have to read. Stuff that we find through research, and then we have to read it. And eventually, we'll have to summarize it. We might have to analyze it. We'll talk about what we think about it. And then we're ultimately going to use it for our research paper. So you guys will be choosing research topics in a few weeks, around week 4. So we're not quite ready to do that yet, but we can start thinking about potential topics soon. And once you have a topic selected, we start researching it. So you might start finding sources of your own as early as week 4 or week 5. But until then, I'll provide some sample sources beginning this week that we can read and practice with. But before we can start doing any of that work, we just need to think a little bit more about how we read sources, how we need to approach sources, how do we handle them, how do we manage them. And in order to do a good job with all of that, we need to become active and critical readers. So if you took my 101 class, you might remember me talking a little bit about this at the beginning of 101. Because for me, this is kind of a foundational concept for all of the English classes I teach. I even talk about this a little bit with my upper level literature classes, because it doesn't matter how old you are, what level you're at, if you're in an English class, you probably need to work on your critical and active reading skills, because a lot of us don't practice these when we are reading for pleasure, when we are reading in our free time. Let's say you're reading a magazine article or something you found online, or maybe you're reading a book, sci-fi, fantasy, something that you enjoy, not an assignment from school, right? Just something that you like. I mean, some of us like to read, maybe not all of us, but we all read, right? If you enjoy reading, you probably read books and maybe some articles. If you're not a huge reader, maybe you don't seek out long texts, but you still read, right? You read emails, you read text messages, you read stuff on social media. So we all read. All right, let's just get that out of the way. Let's establish that right off the bat. Whether you enjoy reading, whether you think of yourself as a big reader or not, you can't function in the world without reading. You have to read street signs. You have to read instructions. So Sometimes if you're watching a show, you might have to read something while watching. So reading's just a part of our daily life. We all do it. But most of the time when we're reading stuff either for pleasure or something simple like a text message or a street sign, we don't necessarily have to be super active or critical when we're reading. We can read in a more passive, more casual way, because we're all literate, and if it's a simple message, or if it's something that we're never going to be tested on, something that we're never really going to be asked about, we can treat it pretty lightly. We can be pretty casual. We can read it. We don't typically take notes. We might even be a little bit distracted while we're reading. We might be playing music. You guys know what I mean, right? You guys multitask. You might have multiple windows open, multiple browser windows, going at the same time. You might be talking to somebody while you're reading. You might be listening to something, a podcast, a song. You might have a lot of different things happening at once. So you're still able to generally understand what you're reading. But if it's casual, if it's passive, if it's something for fun, something that's not terribly important, you're not usually paying close attention, you're not usually taking notes, and you're not usually being very active or critical. And that's fine. When it's stuff in your typical life, that's fine. But when you're reading stuff for school, it's not really good enough to read in that way, with all of those distractions, being kind of casual, and also just relying on your memory. Because if you don't write anything down while you read, you are relying exclusively on your memory. And that's fine if nobody's ever going to ask you questions about what you read. But if it's a school assignment, if it's something that you need for a class, you can assume that you're going to be held responsible for that reading. You're going to be asked questions about it. You might have to summarize it. You might have to respond to it. You might have to use it at some point. So if that's the case, if it's no longer just fun and games, but if there's actually stakes involved, right? You're responsible for it. You're going to be graded on it. You're going to have to use it. Now, the way we read needs to change. We can't be passive. We can't be casual. We need to be active and critical. And in order to do that, we really just need to adopt a few pretty simple strategies. And some of us might already do this stuff. If you remember anything from 101, from my 101, you might have picked a few of these up. But if not, it's time to start now. Some really basic strategies that I want us to start practicing this week with the sample articles that I've posted in the week 1 module. So let's start with underlining. Very simple, very easy. And you don't have to underline. You can also highlight, you can circle, you can put stuff in brackets, whatever you want. But this is just a way to emphasize the most important parts of a text. So if you're reading a potential source, newspaper article, book chapter, something from a good website, you always want to try to keep a record of the most important ideas, the most important statements, really important individual words or phrases. You want to highlight those. You want to emphasize those so you can think more about them, and perhaps most importantly, so you can find them easily later if you need to return to that text and do something else with it. So you can find whatever method works for you. I'm a big underliner. I just use my pen and I underline the words, the sentences, the ideas that I think are really important. A lot of other people prefer to highlight. You might have another method, whatever you want. But just try to emphasize the most important things that you are reading. Okay? And that way, when you go back, when you revisit the text, you'll be able to find those most important passages. And you're probably going to want to do more with them. You can form your own opinions about them. You might agree with them. You might disagree with them. But you want to be able to highlight them, emphasize them, clearly mark them in the text so you can do stuff later. And you'll notice a lot of our potential sources are going to be kind of lengthy. I mean, they're going to vary in length. Some might be 15, 20 pages. Some might only be a couple of pages. But they're all going to be longer than just a couple of paragraphs. So any substantial source is going to require some degree of underlining or highlighting, because you can't just remember it all, right? This is the way we start creating a written record. This is the way we start to write things down so we're better able to understand our source, we're better able to summarize it, and we're better able to use it later on. So start by underlining or highlighting whatever technique you prefer, and then move on to our second strategy, which is annotation. This is just another way of saying take notes while you read. Okay? And I have trouble sometimes getting students to do this, because one thing students notice right away is that this typically adds time to the reading experience. If you are reading a 5 or 6 page article, that might take you 20 or 30 minutes just reading. And if you have to also take notes while you read, you might notice that you're adding 10, 15 minutes on top of the time you would have already spent. And a lot of students don't really want to do that. And I understand we're busy, we have a lot of other things to do. But the extra time is worth it. Because if you don't take notes, if you don't jot down some ideas and some interpretations of your own while you're reading these sources, you're just going to make it tougher for yourself later on. Okay? So the good thing about taking notes in this way is there's really no rules. You can do whatever you want. You can write down whatever you want, whatever is helpful for you. But typically, the stuff that you've underlined, the stuff that you've highlighted, you need to jot down notes to go along with that. Because if you just underline something but don't write anything down about it, you're probably going to forget later why you underlined it. Well, I guess I thought it was important, but now, a month after I read it, I no longer remember why it was important. I forgot the larger context. I forgot the rest of the article, so I don't know why I underlined that one particular sentence. It doesn't, the underlining doesn't do much good without annotations to go along with it. Okay? So anything that's important enough to make you underline it or highlight it, you should also write a brief note about it. And these notes or annotations can take a lot of different forms. In some cases, they can just be comments. How do you feel about that statement? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you find it interesting? Do you find it strange? Is it something that perhaps you've never really thought about before? You can write that down. In other cases, you're almost doing like translation. Because one thing we'll notice about some of our sources is that they might be somewhat difficult to read in some cases, particularly academic sources that might be written by scientists or doctors or other experts in a field. They know more about the subject matter than we do. They might use language and terminology that we're not really familiar with. We might have to look up some stuff. We might have to use Google to find out what a particular word means or what a particular idea is that they're trying to express. And don't feel bad. That is part of critical reading. You're thinking critically. You're also being active. Right? Because you might have to look something up. You're going to have to write some stuff down. So anytime you come across a word, a name, an event, an idea that's just not familiar to you, you've never heard of it, you don't know what it is, don't feel bad. Google it. Find out what it is. You need to know. You can't leave those questions unanswered. You need to know. And once you find out, you can write that down as an annotation. These can also be definitions of words. Again, if you don't recognize a word, just look it up. and then you can write down the definition. But in some cases, you need to sort of translate the complex language of the source into your own words. In some cases, you might want to rephrase or restate an idea in your own words. That helps you to better understand it. That helps you to summarize it, to respond to it, to use it. If it's in your own words, if you're using phrasing and sentence structure that you would normally use in everyday life, it sounds like you now. It doesn't sound like this scientist who writes and talks very differently from you. So think of it as a little bit of a process of translation. Getting this stuff in your own language, explaining some of this stuff that you read to yourself in your own words, in your own notes. You can also jot down ideas of your own. If you disagree, you can write down a counter argument, comparisons, or anything else that occurs to you while you read. But again, if you find something important that you want to highlight or underline, jot down a note as well. And these notes, they can be very rough. They don't have to be in complete sentences. You can even use a sort of shorthand, a kind of like abbreviation system if you don't want to write out certain words or if you want to kind of be more efficient, because we are kind of trying to write fast, right? We don't want to spend forever taking these notes. So you can develop a system of your own. When I take notes, I definitely use shorthand. I'll abbreviate long words. I'll leave out articles. I'll express it in a way that makes sense to me. It might not make sense to somebody else who's reading my notes, but it makes sense to me. As long as these notes make sense to you, that's the most important thing. But you want to write these down. That helps you to better understand the text that you're reading, and later you'll be able to respond to it because you've already started to generate some ideas. You have some stuff written down that you might be able to pursue further, all right, and a future assignment. So that's nice as well. Now, typically, in the old days, when everything was printed out and everything was in hard copy form, we would take notes directly on our sources. We would print out newspaper articles or journal articles, and then we could mark them up. We could underline them, and then we could write a lot of our annotations in the margins. The margins just meaning like the sides of the page, or even at the bottom of the page or the top of the page. It would make some of these printouts a little bit messy, but that was okay. We weren't going to have to turn those in. The notes, these annotations, you're never going to have to turn them in. They're never going to be submitted to me formally, right? They are strictly for your own benefit. So that's how we used to do it. Nowadays, people don't really print stuff anymore. I understand that we do most of our reading on a computer screen, and that's okay. You can still underline and you can still annotate. If you're using Adobe to read PDFs, or if you have some similar program that you're using to read a lot of this stuff, I strongly recommend figuring out how to annotate. There's usually an easy way to do it. You can do it with a Word doc. You can do it with a PDF. If you're using Google Docs, you can definitely do it. Well, that would be more for like something you wrote, but you need to get comfortable with the annotation feature in whatever program you're using. A lot of the stuff I'm going to post for you will be in PDF form. All right. But when you start researching yourself, you might be finding PDFs. You might be finding stuff in HTML. It just kind of depends on your preference and how you want to format your sources or how you want to read them. But however you're doing it, you need to be able to highlight or underline and annotate on your computer. Some of us might still do it the old-fashioned way, but just make sure you can do it with stuff that you're reading on your computer screen. And if there's just no way for you to annotate on the screen, remember, you can always have separate notes on a separate sheet of paper or in a notebook and that works fine too. Just create a system that works for you. Okay? So if you take a look at the reading assignment for this week, it's pretty short. It's just called Reading Sources Part 1. It's a PDF document. It's a chapter that I ripped off from a textbook that we're not using, but I am using some of these readings from the book. And if you take a look at that reading assignment, you'll notice that there is a nice example of a student's annotations on page 5. Okay? And just take a look at that. You don't have to read them word for word, but just get a sense for what typical annotations look like. Look at the sorts of things that student is writing down. And you'll notice a lot of stuff that I've already mentioned. Definitions, comparisons. Sometimes he's explaining or summarizing important statements made by the author of the text, observations of his own, ideas and interpretations of his own. Those are the things that we typically find in annotations. And that does remind me, I should have mentioned this earlier, we don't have a textbook in this class. So the reading assignments will look like what you see in the week 1 module. They will usually be PDFs that I post to the weekly modules in Canvas, and you can just read them. All right, we don't actually have a book. All right, you can also look at page 11 of the week 1 reading for another example of what some typical annotations would look like. And then finally, our third active and critical reading strategy is asking questions. This might sound kind of obvious or elementary, but I really want to stress this a little bit because one thing I've noticed is a lot of students don't feel comfortable asking questions about what they read because they seem to think that they should already know everything about that text. And if they ask questions, it might suggest that they didn't do the reading or they didn't do a very good job of it. They don't understand. They get sort of embarrassed or worried about that. So they don't ask questions. Or at least they often don't ask the right kinds of questions because they might be a little nervous about that. I just want to stress that asking questions is normal and natural when you're doing research. Because as I've mentioned, a lot of the sources that you find over the course of your research will be difficult. They will be complex. They will be sometimes written for experts or specialists. So you're not going to understand everything right away. Even in a newspaper article, it might be pretty easy to read, but there might be some stuff in there that you're not familiar with. You have to look it up. You have to think more about it. That's fine. Never feel bad about that. That's just learning. That's just the process of learning more about your topic, learning more about your sources. There's never anything wrong with that. Now, you eventually want to get to the conclusion of all of that work, but it's never a bad thing to ask questions. In fact, it's required for this kind of work. You really have to ask some questions about the sources that you're reading. Now, sometimes those questions might show up as annotations. They might show up as some of the notes that you're taking, because you'll often have questions over the course of reading a source. You might be like, yeah, I don't know what he means by that. I don't know what she's getting at in this paragraph. I don't know what this word means. I don't know who this person that they're talking about is. They can be simple questions that you can quickly find answers to. But they might also be like bigger picture questions about the larger argument or point that the author is making, or about something else that's being discussed in the source. It might take days or even weeks to answer some of those questions. You might need to ask me. You might need to ask a classmate, a friend, somebody who might know more about the topic. That's okay. That's all part of the process. So don't feel sheepish about that. So you can always write questions down when you're annotating, but I would also recommend writing some questions down once you are finished reading the text. Okay, so once you're at the end of your article or your book chapter, the website, whatever, you're finished reading, you've underlined some stuff, You've written down some notes. Great. Before you move on, before you take a break or start doing your math homework, before you leave that text, go ahead and jot down some questions. Again, they can be really rough. They can just be part of your notes, really. But don't move on until you've written some of these questions down. Okay, questions that you think you can answer yourself, maybe some bigger questions that you could potentially need a little bit of help with. It doesn't matter. Just the act of asking questions will better enable you to both engage with what you are reading and connect with it. It just brings you closer to the text. It makes you think more about the text. It's going to help you to form opinions. It's going to help you to potentially analyze the text at a later date. And it just gets you more engaged. You can write down the answers that you find. You might just be able to keep them in your brain, but you always want to ask questions. And there's really two levels when it comes to question asking that you can sort of approach. The first level is what we call the micro level. And that's really about a lot of the things that you're taking notes on, right? Individual words in your source, individual sentences, individual statements or ideas being expressed by the author. Make sure you understand all of those. And if you come across a word, a sentence, an idea that you don't understand, ask a question about it and try to get to the bottom of it. I notice that sometimes when students come across something in an article that they don't understand, they just skip over it. They're just like, oh, I don't know about that. Let me just move on. No, don't move on. Figure it out. And once you figure it out, write it down. Sometimes it's as simple as a Google search or a visit to dictionary.com, and you can answer some of these micro questions about individual words or sentences. But then the larger level when it comes to questions is the macro level. So that means you're keeping in mind sort of bigger questions about the overall meaning of a text, the overall purpose of the author. What are they trying to accomplish? Are they trying to inform us? Are they trying to persuade us? If they want to persuade us, what is it that they're trying to convince us of? What is their argument? What is their point? What is the purpose of the text? Those are more macro questions, but more bigger picture questions. But you should always be able to answer those. If you can't answer those, that means that you should probably revisit the text, maybe read it again, because you still need to answer some of those big questions. Okay. So those are basic strategies that I would like us to use throughout the semester for everything that we read, beginning this week, and definitely including all of the sources that you find yourselves once you've chosen your own research topics. Okay, so before we wrap up here in week one, I just want to tell you some general things about sources, because the kind of reading that we're doing in here is different than the reading we do on a daily basis, like I was saying. So I just want to give you some warnings. I want to give you a little bit of encouragement and just some general preparation so you are ready to tackle the kinds of reading that we do in here. So a few things to remember about reading sources. And again, when I say sources, I mean newspaper articles, magazine articles, in some cases, chapters of books. We're not usually going to tackle entire books. We don't have time, but maybe academic journal articles. We'll talk more about those soon. Or even informational or educational websites. Okay, those are typical sources, but also possibly videos, like I said, news programs or documentaries sometimes work well also. So when we're reading, though, we'll talk about videos later, when we are reading sources, let's keep a few things in mind. Number one, sources are meant to inform, more than they are meant to entertain. All right, so again, a lot of the stuff that we read for pleasure or that we read in our free time is meant to entertain us. It's meant to keep us interested. It's meant to maybe be exciting or fun in some way. Now, that might be true of some of your sources, but a lot of sources are not really designed to be super entertaining. They're designed to be informative or possibly persuasive. And that's definitely true of academic journals and some of the more academic sources that we use. Sometimes newspaper or magazine articles might be a little bit more fun to read, but they still have a larger purpose. They're not simply there to be fun. Right? So again, they're there to inform us or to persuade us or to explain something complex to us. That's usually the kind of work that sources are doing. So you need to know that. Go in to your research with that expectation so you're not disappointed later. Yes, sometimes some of the sources that you read will be maybe a little boring. They might not thrill you. They might not strike you as super fun. That's okay. It is school, after all. I try to make it as fun as possible, at least this class, but we can't have fun all the time. And some of your sources will not be fun, but they'll still be important. They'll be useful. You need to read them. You need to grapple with them, even if you're not having the most fun of your life. Okay? So just go in with that understanding. That's number one. Number two, sometimes sources can be a little difficult to read. Again, they're not here as entertainment. They're serving an educational or an informative or a persuasive function. And in some cases, like with maybe more long-form journalism or certain academic sources, again, some of this stuff might be intended for scholars, experts, practitioners in the field. And a lot of our sources will not be written for a general audience. You know, popular books, so a lot of stuff on like sports or pop culture websites, those are written for a general audience. Anybody, any literate adult can read them and enjoy them. But a lot of our sources will not be like that. They're not really intended for a general audience. They're intended, in many cases, for a specialized audience, like science majors or people who do a certain kind of work. So there's going to be specialized language. There's going to be more complex ideas. Again, it's not there to entertain. It's there for bigger purposes. So as a result, that can make the reading process a little bit harder. A little bit more time consuming. So don't assume that all of your sources will be clear or immediately easy to understand. Some will be, but some will not be. And that's okay. You can get through it. It might be a little difficult. It might take a couple of different sittings. It might take a couple of days to work your way through a particularly complex source. But that's okay. We're going to have the time to do that. I'm going to give you the tools necessary to do that. And you just have to be willing to put in the work. Okay? But don't get discouraged if you don't immediately understand everything in a source. That's normal. That's part of the process. That's part of learning. That's part of research. So don't feel bad at all. However, if you don't understand right away, just remember, that's why rereading and note-taking and critical thinking are really important. Sometimes you really do have to read a source more than once. And those annotations are going to be really important to help you understand and to help you remember. So that's why we practice a lot of these strategies, so that we're better able to deal with complex texts. All right? Also, so that's number two. Number three, to remember what you've read, you really have to write things down. So I've already been talking about this with underlining and annotating. But remember, we're not reading casually in this class. We're not strictly reading for pleasure. So that means that you are responsible for understanding everything that you read in here. And if you're responsible for what you've read, that means that you must remember what you read. And if you want to remember it, you need to take notes. You have to write stuff down. Some of us might think that we have good memories, and I'm sure many of us do. But even if you do, it's been proven by neurologists that, and like other kinds of like neuroscientists, that the human brain is not great at remembering what we read. We're better at remembering other things, firsthand experiences, things that we say, things that we hear, things that we read, however, because it's not as direct, things that we read often get forgotten. That's just true of almost all people. So again, don't feel bad, that's normal, but in order to overcome that obstacle, you have to write stuff down. You can't just rely on your memory. Another thing to keep in mind is that in some cases, you'll find a source, maybe early in the semester, but then you don't actually use the source until much later in the semester. So you're definitely not going to remember all of the important things in that source 2 weeks later, or a month later, or 2 months later. There's no way. So you have to use that written record that I've been talking about. That comes from underlining or highlighting, annotating, and asking questions. You have to do all of that. And then sometimes it's also helpful to jot down brief summaries once you're finished reading something. While it's still fresh in your mind, while you still have your notes right in front of you, all of your highlighting or underlining is right in front of you, you have a few questions jotted down, it's nice to just sketch out a brief summary while all of that is still very fresh. But we're going to be practicing our summarizing skills in the weeks to come, so we'll talk more about that soon. All right? So always have that written record. And it's also important to be organized. You need to hang on to your notes. Make sure you're not losing this stuff as the semester goes on. So you might want to start a document that you can maintain on your computer. You might want to do this by hand, keep it in a notebook. But you need to be organized so you have all of your notes, all of your summaries in one place. And let me just say one more time. Again, I know we don't want to add time to our reading. We want to be efficient, but what I want to make you understand is that taking notes is efficient. All right, it might add a little bit of time to your reading process, but it's going to save you time later. Because if you take good notes, if you have a good written record, and let's say months pass, and you have to return to this source and work with it and incorporate it into your final paper, well, because you took good notes, you might not necessarily have to go back and reread that entire source. You've probably forgotten a lot of it, but you can consult your notes. You can consult that summary that you jotted down. You can look at the answers to the questions that you asked 2 months ago. You have a lot of it written down. You've already highlighted some of the most important passages in the text. So you can use all of that work that you've already done to then utilize that source to accomplish whatever it is that you want to accomplish. But if you don't take notes, if you blow it off, if you say, yeah, I'll remember, I'm not worried about it, I'm moving on, then when those 2 months pass and you come back to the source and you just have a clean document with no writing, no underlining, no notes, just pristine, clean, like the day it was born, that's not going to really help you very much, right? You don't remember. It's been too long and you didn't write anything down. So what are you going to have to do with that source now? Most likely, read it again. So this is the point I always make. If you don't take notes, you will always end up repeating work later on. Work that you've already done. You read that article 2 months ago, but now you have to read it again because you don't remember it and you didn't take any notes. So that written record will always save you time later in the semester. So commit to the work now so you'll have a little bit less work to do later. That's always the best way. All right. Number 4, don't exclusively seek out sources that agree with your own personal viewpoint. Now, obviously, we always want some sources that will back up and support our opinions, our views. Eventually, that's what we're going to do when we build our own original arguments. We want sources that can support our claims, that we can use as evidence to sort of, exemplify what we want to show, what we want to prove. That's great. But not all of your sources necessarily need to do that. You also need to be exposed to a wide range of different perspectives and ideas. So that means you need to read a lot of different viewpoints. You need to read a lot of different sources. You'll find some stuff that you agree with. You'll find other stuff that you don't agree with, and that's fine. Because you want to get a greater sense. Once you've selected a topic, you want to get a larger sense of the debate or the argument that surrounds that topic. What are people saying? What are the different positions? What are the different arguments that have been made? And then you can locate your own position within that larger framework or that larger context. But in order to do that, you have to be exposed to a wide range of stuff, not just the stuff that you agree with. It's also just a good general practice to be exposed to a lot of different ideas, a lot of different perspectives. Again, you don't have to change your mind. You just need to have a better understanding of what your opponents, what the other side might have to say. And by doing that, you'll be more informed. You'll be able to make more informed choices about what you want to say and what you want to do in your own work. All right? And then finally, my fifth and final tip about reading sources is to understand the difference between credible sources and non-credible sources. So we'll talk more about this in the weeks to come, but you guys have to use judgment when you're selecting sources. Not all sources are created equally, and not all sources are equally reliable. So in this class, we generally stick to a few different categories. And I've already mentioned most of them. Academic sources. That means usually like academic journal articles or maybe book chapters from scholarly books. Those are always good. We can also lean on newspaper and magazine journalism. I know some people question how objective a lot of that journalism is, and I would agree. It's not always 100% objective, but we can definitely find largely objective journalism. And the 2 articles I posted in the week 1 module are good examples of the kinds of newspaper articles that we can use. And of course, nobody actually reads traditional newspapers anymore. So when I say newspapers nowadays, I really mean newspaper articles that we read online. Because basically every newspaper, every news magazine that exists on Earth has a website. And you can read their articles on their website. And that's typically what we do. So we like newspaper and magazine articles as long as they are newsy, right, and somewhat objective. We also like certain websites. But these are going to be websites created by either government offices, colleges and universities, or nonprofit organizations. Again, these aren't perfect. Not all of the stuff from those types of sites are going to be useful, but we can usually consider that stuff reliable. However, we want to avoid other types of websites like commercial websites, most.coms, because they're usually trying to sell you something. That's what it means to be commercial. You are engaging in business, you are selling things, you are trying to make money. So most of the stuff that we're going to find on those websites will be monetized, or it's being used in some kind of monetary way. So that makes it a little bit less reliable. The exception being if it's the homepage of a newspaper or a magazine. Those will typically be .coms, like Wall Street Journal's webpage or the New York Times. We can use those, right? But other .com websites, no, probably not. We're not going to use social media posts most of the time. There might be some exceptions. We're not going to use blogs. We're not going to use stuff that's coming from an obviously political point of view. Again, it can be hard to avoid that altogether, but we just want to use our best judgment. If it seems really partisan, like really slanted towards a particular political camp, that's not always going to be as useful for us. Even if we agree with it, even if we think the article is right, it might not jive with what we are doing in here. There's the possibility that you could use it, but typically we want stuff that's a little bit more objective, stuff that's going to be more research-based, stuff that's going to have statistics, a lot of really good evidence, stuff that's going to have sort of an academic or a professional sort of sheen to it. So if it's really like a personal attack or a personal blog or somebody's strongly held opinion, we often want to be careful before we jump into those. And if you ever have a choice, or if you ever have a choice between, a bad one and a good one, choose the good one. And if you ever have a question about a particular source, because there are exceptions to these rules. So if you have a question about a source that you're thinking about using, you're not quite sure about it, ask me. Send me an email, maybe send me the source, let me look at it, and we can talk more about it, okay? I don't like to be an absolutist. There's always exceptions to rules, but run it by me if you're in doubt, okay? So those are my tips. Pretty basic stuff. If you have any questions, let me know. If you have questions about Canvas, if you have questions about anything in the syllabus, reach out and we can talk more. The last thing I will mention is that we have our first research journal assignment due this week. So if you notice in the syllabus, we do research journals pretty much every week. We have 10 of them total. So we don't do them on the weeks where we have big major assignments. But every other week, we will do a research journal. These are pretty informal, brief writing assignments that basically ask you to kind of reflect on what we've learned that week. And then later weeks, they're going to ask you to do some pretty active stuff, like a proposal, coming up with research questions. So a lot of times the research journals just help us with whatever we're currently working on. It's a chance for you to show me that you understand the material that we are covering. I don't do quizzes. I don't do tests. That seems Mickey Mouse to me. This is college, okay? Everything is about what we write. We're mostly getting geared up for our big paper. We're going to have a bibliography. We're going to have other writing assignments connected to our research paper. And the research journals kind of function like a weekly quiz. They just show me that you're keeping up, you're doing the work, and you understand the key concepts that we're covering. I like to keep them kind of light, kind of informal, so as long as we do well with them, I'll see no need to make any changes. All right, so take a look at all the assignments, take a look at the schedule, get comfortable with Canvas, make sure you can use your email, and the last thing you might want to do before week 1 ends is make sure you can access the GBC library homepage. Because once we start doing research, we are going to rely heavily on our library resources. So that means you have to be able to log in to the library so you can use the databases found there. So just make sure you can do that. If you're having problems, let me know, or maybe let computer services know so they can get you logged in. So get in touch if you have anything you want to talk about. Otherwise, I will see you next week in the Week 2 lecture.